To millions, he was the ultimate patriarch. To the network, he was a threat that had to be erased. The dark truth behind the brutal firing of John Amos, how Good Times was destroyed by network racism, exposes a man who refused to separate his real-life integrity from his sitcom role. He launched a fierce rebellion against white scripts that sought to turn his television family into a cheap minstrel act. His reward for defending his community's dignity? A ruthless telegram death sentence. How does a man go from being the soul of a generation to being executed in the shadows without a single on-screen farewell? On screen, the betrayal unfolded with devastating suddenness. It was the season 4 premiere of Good Times. The Evans family, after enduring years of crushing poverty in the Cabrini Green housing projects of Chicago, were packing their belongings. They were preparing to move to Mississippi. James Evans had traveled ahead to secure a new job and a permanent home. The atmosphere in the apartment was filled with genuine joy and anticipation. The dream of a better life was finally within their grasp. Then came a knock at the door. It was a telegram. Florida Evans opened the yellow envelope. There was no screeching of tires on a wet road. There was no dramatic bedside farewell in a hospital ward. There was no funeral broadcast for the audience to mourn. There was only a cold piece of paper. Florida read the words aloud, her voice breaking. James Evans had been killed in a car crash. The strongest black father on television had vanished in the space of a commercial break. The viewing public was deeply shocked. They had invested their hearts in this family. They trusted the network to treat these characters with respect. The sudden disappearance of James Evans felt like a personal loss. But as the shock subsided, a profound sense of outrage took its place. Audiences soon realized this was not a tragic narrative choice. It was a calculated erasure. Hollywood had found the M.O., an efficient method to eliminate an actor who refused to cooperate. Killing a character off screen is a deliberate industry tactic. It is the safest route for a television network. It prevents any risk of an on-set confrontation. It nullifies the need for contract disputes. Most importantly, it strips the actor of the opportunity to give their character a dignified closure. John Amos was not simply fired. He was surgically removed from the narrative. The network needed to ensure he could never return. They buried James Evans before the cameras even started rolling. John Amos was forged in the harsh streets of Newark. Before acting, he was a physically imposing athlete, a Golden Gloves boxer, and a professional football player. He also worked as a social worker at the Vera Institute of Justice, looking daily into the eyes of young black men chewed up by a relentless criminal justice system. When he transitioned to Hollywood, he didn't leave that reality behind. He brought a street-forged mentality, an unbreakable pride, and absolutely zero patience for the deferential diplomacy the industry expected. He wasn't just stepping onto a soundstage, he was carrying the weight of the men society had left behind. This was the raw material he poured into the character of James Evans. On paper, the network writers created a man with a mere 6th grade education, a laborer trapped in a low-wage cycle. Amos took that baseline and built a titan. He infused James with a towering self-respect, a ferocious work ethic, and a protective love that could not be compromised. He was not merely performing a role for a sitcom. He was meticulously recreating the hard-working, marginalized men he had known his entire life. To John Amos, James Evans was not a fiction. He was a monument to the real men of his community, a reflection of the fathers fighting to survive in the concrete margins of America. In 1974, The American television landscape was undergoing a seismic, yet tightly controlled evolution. The major networks were taking cautious, heavily calculated steps toward reflecting the actual demographic reality of the country. Norman Lear, a titan of television production, was the primary architect of this shift. He had created massive, unprecedented hits that tackled political and social issues, breaking long-held industry taboos. One of his most successful properties was the hit show Maude, which featured a fiercely intelligent black housekeeper named Florida Evans. The character was immensely popular with audiences. The network, sensing a highly lucrative opportunity, greenlit a spin-off. The original concept presented by the production team, however, was painfully standard for the era's limited and prejudiced imagination regarding black life. They envisioned Florida as a single mother, struggling to raise her children alone in the inner city. It was a well-worn, exhausted trope. It leaned heavily into the black single mother stereotype, a narrative that subtly suggested the absence of the black patriarch was an inevitable, almost natural state of being within the community. Esther Roll, the formidable actress portraying Florida, drew a hard, uncompromising line in the sand. She possessed a deep, acute understanding of the media's power to shape societal perceptions and internal community self-worth. She flatly refused the premise. She recognized the immense psychological damage that broadcasting another fatherless black family on primetime television would inflict on the psyche of the audience. She issued a non-negotiable ultimatum to the most powerful producers in Hollywood. She stated clearly that she would not anchor the spinoff unless Florida had a husband. She demanded a strong, present, and actively involved black father. The producers, eager to launch a guaranteed hit, capitulated to her demands. They needed to find a man who could instantly convey absolute authority, deep love, and a hardened, undeniable realism. They needed someone who did not look like a polished Hollywood caricature, but rather a man who looked as though he had walked straight off a construction site or a factory floor. This is the exact moment John Amos stepped into the frame, altering television history. He was not a traditional comedic actor. He did not possess the lightweight, eager-to-please demeanor typical of sitcom leads of the time. When he walked into the audition room, he brought the heavy weight of his Newark upbringing and his grueling years working in the Brooklyn House of Detention. He was physically imposing, carrying broad shoulders and a gaze that commanded immediate, unspoken respect. He did not ask for attention. His sheer presence demanded it. Amos understood immediately what this role required and what was at stake. He knew that James Evans could not be played for cheap, disposable laughs. He had to be the immovable bedrock of the family. Lear and the network executives saw the raw, undeniable authenticity Amos possessed. He was cast to play the husband, stepping into a leading role that was originally never meant to exist. When Good Times premiered, the impact was instantaneous and revolutionary. The setting was stark, avoiding the glossy sheen of typical television homes. The Evans family lived in a cramped, drafty apartment in the Cabrini Green housing projects of Chicago. The set design did not attempt to hide the poverty. It highlighted the peeling paint, the worn furniture, and the constant looming threat of eviction. But at the center of this harsh environment stood John Amos. He fundamentally changed the DNA of the American sitcom. He approached the role of James Evans with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. He did not play a bumbling, clueless television dad who was outsmarted by his children. He played a hyper-vigilant protector, Every movement he made on screen was deliberate and grounded in physical reality. When he sat at the small dining table to calculate the meager family budget, the audience could physically see the tension gripping his jaw and the sheer exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. He wore the agonizing anxiety of providing for 3 children and a wife like a heavy, invisible coat. During the first and second seasons, the tone of Good Times was groundbreakingly serious. The scripts actively addressed the brutal, unvarnished realities of urban survival. The family faced chronic unemployment, systemic racism, neighborhood violence, and the daily, grinding humiliation of being poor in a wealthy nation. Amos became the undisputed anchor for these heavy narratives. He insisted on portraying James with absolute uncompromising dignity. When the script called for James to lose a job or face a demotion, Amos did not play the moment for pity or sympathy. He played it with a simmering, tightly suppressed rage. It was the recognizable rage of a highly capable man denied the opportunity to work and provide solely because of the color of his skin or his lack of a formal education. Amos brought an unprecedented emotional vocabulary to the television screen. He demonstrated that a man could be physically tough enough to face down armed street gangs, yet emotionally vulnerable enough to hold his wife with profound, quiet tenderness. He portrayed a father who demanded strict, unwavering discipline from his children. This discipline was not rooted in cruelty or authoritarianism, but in a desperate, terrifying awareness of what the streets outside their door would do to them if they slipped even once. When James Evans disciplined his sons or guided his daughter, he did not use empty sitcom platitudes. His voice carried the booming, urgent authority of a man actively trying to save their lives. Amos utilized his deep, resonant baritone to command the small apartment set. He made it abundantly clear that while outside society might view James Evans as a high school dropout and a common expendable laborer, inside the walls of his home, he was an absolute king. This portrayal represented a seismic cultural shift in American media. It was the first time in the history of the medium that a sitcom centered entirely on a complete black family, mother, father, and children, living, struggling, and surviving together in a contemporary urban setting. The historical and psychological significance of this cannot be overstated. For decades, black audiences had been starved of accurate, respectful reflections of their own lives. They had endured an endless parade of degrading caricatures, ranging from subservient maids to comical wide-eyed sidekicks. Now, right in the middle of primetime viewing hours, stood a family that looked, sounded, and loved exactly like theirs. The emotional response from the viewing public was a tidal wave of validation. Bags of mail poured into the studio weekly. Families gathered around their television sets every week as if attending a vital communal event. Black viewers across the nation watched John Amos and instantly recognized their own fathers, their uncles, and their grandfathers. They saw the men who worked 2 grueling shifts at the steel mill, the men who came home with calloused hands and aching backs, the men who sacrificed their own dreams and bodies so their children could finish school. Amos validated their existence. He broadcasted their silent, unglamorous heroism to millions of people who had previously ignored it. The prevailing feeling was one of profound hope and swelling pride. The portrayal systematically shattered the pervasive, damaging myth of the absent black father. It forced white America to look directly at a black man living in a notorious housing project and recognize his universal humanity, his fierce devotion, and his unshakable moral fortitude. Amos was not merely entertaining an audience. He was systematically dismantling deep-seated prejudices with every single line he delivered. He gave a master class in quiet, restrained power. The audience felt safe with him. They trusted, implicitly, that no matter how dire the financial crisis of the week was, no matter what threats loomed outside, James Evans would physically and morally stand between his family and ruin. The true magnitude of Amos's achievement lay in the strict mechanics of his performance. During these early golden years, he operated with a fierce, almost territorial protectiveness over the character's integrity. He carefully scrutinized the blocking, the camera angles, and the stage directions. If a director suggested a comedic physical reaction that felt unnatural, buffoonish, or degrading for a proud man, Amos would quietly but firmly refuse to execute it. He understood profoundly that comedy derived from pain must be handled with surgical precision. The humor of the Evans family did not come from their ignorance or foolishness. It came from their sharp defensive wit. It was the dark, necessary humor of survival. Amos ensured that James Evans was never the butt of the joke. He could be stubborn, he could be traditionally flawed, he could be wrong in an argument, but he was never, under any circumstances, foolish. He built an incredibly authentic and powerful dynamic with Esther Rowley. Together they established a partnership on screen that radiated deep mutual respect. Their scenes together were marked by a profound unspoken shorthand that only comes from shared lived experience. A simple glance from Amos across the kitchen set conveyed volumes of shared history, mutual reliance, and unspoken fears. They presented an absolute united front against the hostilities of the outside world. This level of marital solidarity was revolutionary in a television era where sitcom husbands and wives often treated each other with mild contempt or endless bickering. Amos and Roll showed a black marriage that was fiercely romantic, deeply practical, and entirely unbreakable. It was a radical political statement perfectly disguised as domestic television. The storylines Amos anchored during the Sarah did not pull their punches. In one defining episode, the family discovers they have been sold tainted meat by a local grocer. In another, James faces a humiliating culturally biased intelligence test while applying for a menial job. Through all of these indignities, Amos channeled a simmering righteous indignation. He brilliantly portrayed the agonizing friction between a man's boundless internal potential and a society's stubborn refusal to let him utilize it. He showed the audience the exact, devastating emotional cost of systemic inequality. The absolute brilliance of his performance lay in his restraint. He rarely raised his voice to its maximum volume. This calculated restraint made the rare moments when he did unleash his full anger utterly terrifying and profoundly moving. The viewers felt the intense heat of his frustration through the screen. When he slammed a heavy fist on the dining table, the studio audience jumped in their seats. When he smiled, a rare, hard-earned break in his stoic, hardened facade, the audience genuinely rejoiced. He single-handedly commanded the emotional weather of the entire series. He became a vital surrogate father figure for countless young viewers who tuned in each week seeking guidance, stability, and strength. The image of John Amos in his trademark canvas work shirts, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, became an indelible American icon of working-class nobility. He proved to the nation that human dignity was not tied to a bank account balance, a prestigious zip code, or a university degree. Dignity was something forged internally, in character and action. In a 1970s media landscape that often reduced inner cities to mere crime statistics, John Amos offered a fierce counter-narrative. He made the Cabrini Green apartment a fortress of respectability. He knew that for many white viewers in Middle America, James Evans was the only black man they willingly invited into their homes each week. He refused to let that representation be anything less than magnificent and true, building a patriarch so universally admired that it seemed impossible the industry would ever dare to dismantle him. Amos's interactions with the younger cast members further solidified the astonishing depth of his performance. He did not treat the actors playing his children, Jimmy Walker, Bernadette Stanis, and Ralph Carter, as mere props meant to set up his own dialogue. He engaged with them with the intense, piercing scrutiny of a real father evaluating his offspring's survival skills. When he looked at his television daughter, Thelma, his eyes visibly softened, projecting a fierce protective barrier against a world that routinely sought to exploit young black women. He portrayed James as a father who was absolutely determined that his daughter would be valued for her fierce intellect and her strong character, not merely her physical appearance. His relationship with his youngest son, Michael, was entirely different, but equally complex and grounded. Michael was written as the militant intellectual of the family, constantly quoting radical literature and aggressively challenging authority. Instead of playing James as a purely reactionary, anti-intellectual authoritarian who crushed his son's rebellious spirit, Amos infused their dynamic with a subtle, underlying pride. James Evans might not have understood every dense political treatise his son read, but Amos showed that the father was immensely proud of the boy's fire and intelligence. He protected Michael's right to think freely, even while strictly demanding respect for the household rules. This highly nuanced approach to parenting on screen was incredibly rare for the time. It showcased a black father who was actively, deeply engaged in the emotional and intellectual development of his children. It demonstrated that James Evans was not just a basic provider of food and shelter, but an active builder of character and mind. Amos made sure the audience implicit understood that the true wealth of the Evans family was not found in their bank account, but in the fierce, unbreakable bonds of their relationships. He crafted a masterwork of television drama, building a fortress of dignity, episode by episode, line by line, look by look. For 2 glorious, groundbreaking seasons, John Amos made the dream of the complete, dignified black family a concrete, undeniable reality on American television. He gave them a patriarch they could look up to without reservation. He gave them a man who stood impossibly tall in a world explicitly designed to keep him on his knees, proving that absolute integrity could command the largest audience in the world. The massive, unprecedented success of the series became the very catalyst for its destruction. When a television program captures the national zeitgeist, the dynamic of production shifts rapidly from artistic expression to corporate asset management. Network executives at CBS observed the weekly Nielsen ratings with intense scrutiny. They studied the demographic breakdowns and monitored the decibel levels of the live studio audience. They identified a specific, highly marketable reaction. The audience, heavily populated by younger viewers seeking escapism, was responding explosively to the oldest son, J.J. Evans. Played by stand-up comedian Jimmy Walker, J.J. was initially conceived as a supporting character, a light-hearted counterweight to the crushing economic realities surrounding the family. But in the ruthless calculus of television broadcasting. A sustained laugh track is the ultimate currency. The network made a swift, calculated decision. They directed the production team to pivot the entire structural foundation of the show. They demanded less drama and more comedy. They wanted to increase the rating share, and they determined that the fastest way to achieve that was to weaponize the teenagers' physical comedy. This directive fundamentally altered the ecosystem of the soundstage. A clear demarcation line was drawn between John Amos's acting methodology and the new direction dictated by the network. Amos was a dramatic actor executing a deeply grounded psychological portrayal of an embattled patriarch. Walker was a highly energetic comedian executing a stand-up routine within the confines of a sitcom set. The writers, responding to the executive's demands, began feeding this new dynamic. They introduced a single explosive catchphrase, "Din o' might." It was delivered with exaggerated facial expressions, popping eyes, and a highly stylized rhythmic vocal inflection. The phrase had no narrative value. It did not advance the plot. It did not reveal character depth. It was a purely mechanical trigger designed to solicit a Pavlovian roar of approval from the studio audience. And it worked with terrifying efficiency. The catchphrase hijacked the narrative. The writers started reverse engineering entire episodes to ensure the catchphrase was delivered at the precise moment before a commercial break. The complex, socially relevant storylines that Amos had fought to establish were rapidly discarded. The daily struggles of finding employment, facing racial discrimination, and maintaining familial unity were replaced by absurd, low-stakes, situational comedy. The scripts began to revolve entirely around JJ's ridiculous schemes to get rich quick, his interactions with local hustlers, and his constant buffoonish posturing. The character was dressed in increasingly outlandish costumes, most notably a floppy chicken hat that completely stripped away any remaining pretense of urban realism. John Amos watched this transformation with a profound, escalating sense of horror. He recognized exactly what was happening. To the network executives, JJ was simply a breakout character driving unprecedented merchandise sales. Lunchboxes, t-shirts, and posters bearing the catchphrase flooded the market. CBS was actively monetizing the simulated poverty of a black F.A., Miley. But to Amos, this was not just a commercial strategy. It was a deeply offensive cultural regression. He saw the systematic resurrection of the exact racial stereotypes he had spent his entire life fighting to eradicate. He recognized the historical weight of the coon caricature, the lazy, intellectually stunted, hyper-animated black man who existed solely to entertain white audiences with his own foolishness. The network was not creating something new. They were dusting off an old, deeply racist minstrel trope, updating the wardrobe, and broadcasting it into millions of homes. The structural marginalization of James Evans was swift and brutal. As JJ became the undeniable center of gravity, the father was systematically pushed to the periphery of his own home. In the early seasons, James was the driving force of the narrative. He was the problem solver, the ultimate authority, the moral compass. Under the new mandate, the writers relegated Amos to the role of a straight man. His primary function became standing in the background, arms crossed, offering a scowl of mild disapproval, while his on-screen son performed a vaudeville routine. The scripts actively dismantled James's authority. A father who was previously depicted as a hyper-vigilant protector, a man who would fiercely discipline any behavior that threatened his family's survival, was now written to tolerate sheer absurdity. Amos was forced to deliver lines that reduced his character to a frustrated spectator in a circus. The racial dynamics of the production crew amplified this friction to an unbearable level. The writer's room dictating these changes was overwhelmingly white. They did not share the lived experiences of the characters they were scripting. They possessed no deep personal understanding of the nuances of black family life in a Chicago housing project. They were crafting jokes based on external observations and established industry formulas. They viewed the Evans family through the lens of sitcom mechanics, completely detached from the social consequences of their portrayals. When they wrote a scene where JJJ celebrated his own academic failure or engaged in petty theft for a laugh, they saw a successful punchline. Amos saw a devastating blow to the dignity of his community. He saw white writers profiting from the degradation of a black narrative. This demographic disconnect created an atmosphere of intense psychological strain for Amos. Every Monday morning, the cast gathered around a large table to read the script for the upcoming episode. For Amos, these table reads became weekly exercises in humiliation and suppressed rage. He would flip through the pages, scanning the dialogue, his jaw tightening with every cheap joke and exaggerated scenario. The physical toll of this internal conflict was visible. The easy confidence he carried during the first season hardened into a rigid, defensive posture. He was a proud man from the streets of Newark, forced to sit under fluorescent studio lights and lend his credibility to a narrative he fundamentally despised. He was being paid to assist in the demolition of the very monument he had helped build. He was not alone in his disgust. Esther Rolla shared his profound disappointment. Together they formed a silent, resilient block of opposition on the set. They communicated their frustration through tight, brief glances between takes. They both understood that the initial promise of the show, the dream of presenting a dignified, unified black family to the American public, was being sold off for cheap laughs and syndicated revenue. Roll had fought aggressively to ensure a father was present in the household. Now she had to watch that father be stripped of his agency and reduced to a background prop, while her television son acted out a minstrel routine. The shared grief between Amos and Rolla anchored them, but it could not stop the momentum of a highly profitable television franchise. The initial feeling of disappointment in Amos rapidly calcified into a cold, hard anger. This was not a temporary creative disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of core values. The network viewed television as a product. Amos viewed it as a platform for cultural survival. He realized that the executives did not care about the social implications of their programming. They were completely indifferent to the psychological damage inflicted on young black viewers who were being taught that clownish ignorance was the most direct path to popularity and success. Hollywood had proven once again that it was perfectly willing to sacrifice a powerful social message the moment a more profitable, less challenging alternative presented itself. They preferred the comfortable, non-threatening caricature of the buffoon over the challenging, demanding reality of a strong black patriarch. This realization ignited a fierce defiance in Amos. He refused to be quietly complicit. He thought about the men he had worked with at the Vera Institute of Justice. He thought about the hard-working fathers in his own neighborhood who were relying on him to tell their truth. The network wanted him to shut his mouth, hit his marks, and collect his paycheck. They expected him to be grateful for the unprecedented opportunity to star on a hit network television show. They severely underestimated his pride. Amos decided that the integrity of James Evans, and by extension the dignity of the community he represented, was not for sale. If the network was going to turn the Cabrini Green apartment into a circus, they were going to have to do it over his fierce vocal and unapologetic resistance. The silent frustration was over. The rebellion was about to begin. The transition from silent disgust to open warfare did not happen overnight. It was a pressure cooker reaching its absolute critical limit. John Amos had spent months absorbing the systematic degradation of the show's original premise. He had watched the nuanced survival dry Venn narrative of a working-class black family be aggressively dismantled and replaced by a vaudeville act. The silent glances of solidarity with Esther Rowley across the set were no longer sufficient. The internal compromise required to participate in this daily charade became psychologically unsustainable. Amos decided to draw a hard, immovable line. He transformed the weekly table reads from standard industry protocol into a hostile battleground for cultural integrity. The rebellion of the real father had officially begun. The battlefield was a sterile, brightly lit conference room on the CBS studio lot. Every Monday, the cast, the directors, and the writing staff gathered around a large table to read the script for the upcoming week's episode. For the writers, this was a routine mechanical test to see where the jokes landed and measure the timing of the comedic beats. For John Amos, it became a weekly tribunal. He stopped being a passive recipient of the dialogue. He became its harshest, most unyielding critic. When a script was placed in front of him, he did not simply read his assigned lines. He interrogated them. He analyzed every interaction, every stage direction, and every punchline through the strict lens of authenticity and black dignity. If he found a line that compromised the core truth of James Evans, he stopped the reading. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply halted the machinery of the production. His method of confrontation was devoid of Hollywood diplomacy. The entertainment industry operates on a heavily coded system of polite suggestions, passive-aggressive notes, and ego management. Amos completely rejected this system. He brought the direct, unvarnished communication style of a Newark street fighter directly into the executive boardroom. When he identified a flaw in the script, he did not couch his criticism in industry jargon. He looked directly at the head writers and dismantled their work with brutal, surgical precision. He pointed and dug out the gaping holes in their logic. He questioned why a fiercely protective, hard-working father would stand silently in a corner while his eldest son made a mockery of their poverty. He demanded to know the narrative justification for the endless parade of foolishness. He forced the writers to defend their choices out loud, stripping away the safety of the typewriter and exposing the cultural ignorance underlying the jokes. The focal point of his outrage was the aggressive centering of Jimmy Walker's character. Amos locked onto the absurd gimmicks, most notably the infamous chicken hat and the relentless mandate to insert dynamite onto every third page. To Amos, these were not comedic tools. They were highly visible symbols of cultural surrender. He argued vehemently that James Evans, a man breaking his back doing manual labor to feed his family, would never tolerate pure buffoonery under his roof. Amos refused to deliver lines that validated this regression. He began crossing out dialogue he deemed offensive, demanding rewrites on the spot. He refused to let James Evans function as a mere setup mechanism for a teenager's punchlines. When directors tried to block a scene requiring him to react with mild comedic exasperation to JJ's antics, Amos substituted the requested reaction with a cold, terrifying stare of genuine anger. He used his physical presence and his resonant voice to reclaim the space the scripts were actively trying to strip away from him. The friction in the writer's room escalated from creative disagreements into deeply uncomfortable confrontations about race and lived experience. The writing staff of Good Times was overwhelmingly white. They were crafting jokes about the realities of a black family living in the Cabrini Green housing projects, yet none of them possessed the first-hand experience required to understand the psychological weight of that existence. Amos forcefully brought this demographic disconnect to the forefront. He refused to let the writers hide behind the defense of just writing comedy. He held them accountable for the cultural impact of their words. He delivered a stinging, undeniable indictment of the entire production structure, a quote that would later define his legacy on the show. He stated plainly, "The truth of it was when the show first started, we had no African American writers. I felt like I knew more about what a black family should be and how a black father would act than our writers, none of whom were black." This statement was not a casual observation. It was a direct, aggressive challenge to the absolute authority of the showrunners. In the hierarchical power structure of 1970s network television, a black actor publicly and repeatedly questioning the competence and cultural authority of white writers was virtually unheard of. It was an act of profound professional insubordination. Amos was explicitly telling the men who controlled his paycheck that they were unqualified to write the story they were profiting from. He was asserting that his lived reality, his understanding of black fatherhood, and his intimate knowledge of the survival tactics required in marginalized communities completely superseded their comedic formulas. He stripped them of their assumed expertise and exposed the glaring blind spots in their creative process. The response from the writing staff and the production executives was immediate and defensive. They did not attempt to understand Amos's perspective. They did not hire black writers to bridge the cultural gap. Instead, they closed ranks and turned the machinery of the industry against him. They began to weaponize his passion. When Amos raised his voice in defense of his character's dignity, they did not hear a man fighting for cultural authenticity. They heard a threat to their production schedule. They categorized his demands for logical, respectful storylines as unreasonable obstacles. The corporate narrative surrounding John Amos began to shift rapidly. He was no longer viewed as the immensely talented actor who anchored their hit show. He was rebranded. The labels difficult, uncooperative, and disruptive began circulating through the executive offices at CBS and Norman Lear's production company. These labels were not neutral. They were heavily loaded, racially coded terms frequently used by the entertainment industry to isolate and neutralize black performers who refused to remain subservient. By labeling Amos as disruptive, the executives successfully deflected attention away from the actual substance of his critiques. They framed the conflict not as a valid debate over racial representation and script quality, but as a simple disciplinary issue regarding an unmanageable employee. They attempted to pathologize his justified anger. Every time Amos stopped a rehearsal to fix a degrading line of dialogue, he was providing the executives with more ammunition to build a case against him. They documented his resistance not as artistic integrity, but as professional misconduct. The psychological toll of this solitary warfare was immense. John Amos was fighting a multi-million-dollar corporate apparatus entirely on his own. While Esther Rowley shared his fundamental disgust with the show's direction, and frequently voiced her own strong objections. Amos took the most aggressive frontline position. He absorbed the brunt of the executive's hostility. He became the primary target for the writer's resentment. The atmosphere on the soundstage grew toxic. The easy camaraderie of the first season completely evaporated, replaced by cold silences, tense standoffs, and rushed productions. Directors hesitated to give Amos notes, fearing another explosive debate about character motivation. The writers began intentionally isolating James Evans in the scripts, minimizing his dialogue and keeping him physically separated from the main comedic action whenever possible. They were actively trying to write him into SS omission. Yet Amos never wavered. He refused to adopt the survival tactic of keeping his head down and collecting his salary. He knew exactly what was at stake. Every time he stepped in front of the studio audience, he felt the heavy responsibility of representing the men who did not have a voice. He knew that the fathers working the night shifts, the men who had been humiliated by the system, and the families fighting to hold themselves together were watching him. He could not look into the camera and deliver a performance that betrayed them. He chose the grueling, exhausting path of constant friction. He fought for every single word, every single camera angle, and every single reaction shot. He turned the set of Good Times into a daily battleground for the soul of the Black father. The tension stretched the production to its absolute breaking point. The network executives realized that Amos could not be intimidated, bought off, or forced into compliance. He possessed an unyielding internal moral compass that they simply could not manipulate. The conflict had moved far beyond a simple disagreement over a catchphrase or a prop. It was a fundamental war over who had the right to define the Black narrative on American television. The writers demanded absolute control over the product. John Amos demanded absolute respect for his people. These two objectives were completely, violently incompatible. The pressure inside the CBS boardroom reached a critical mass. The executives concluded that the only way to save the circus was to violently eliminate the man who kept trying to tear down the tent. The stage was set for one of the most ruthless and permanent betrayals in television history. The breaking point arrived in the stifling silence of the executive suites, far removed from the noise of the studio audience and the heat of the soundstage. By the conclusion of the third season, the standoff between John Amos and the production machinery had paralyzed the internal work-in, GS of the show. The network executives at CBS and Norman Lear's production team were forced into a calculated corporate reckoning. They looked at the soaring merchandise sales generated by Jimmy Walker's buffoonery, and they looked at the relentless, unyielding demands for cultural dignity coming from John Amos. In the ruthless calculus of network television, the decision required no moral deliberation. The executives chose the path of least resistance and maximum profit. They determined that the moral anchor of the show had become its greatest liability. The mandate was quietly finalized behind closed doors. John Amos could not be managed. He could not be broken, and therefore he had to be completely eliminated from the ecosystem he had helped to build. The enforcement of this mandate was chilling in its brevity. It did not happen during a heated argument on set. It did not happen in a face-to-face meeting where grievances could be aired and debated. It happened over a telephone line. As the cast prepared to return for the filming of the fourth season in the late summer of 1976, John Amos received a direct call from Norman Lear. Lear was one of the most powerful men in television, a producer celebrated for bringing progressive, socially conscious narratives to the American public. Yet in this moment, He wielded his authority with the cold, absolute precision of a corporate executioner. The conversation was entirely devoid of sentimentality or artistic discussion. According to Amos's own recollections, Lear delivered the verdict in 2 brief, devastating sentences. He informed Amos that the show had been officially picked up by the network for another 24 episodes. Then, he delivered the fatal blow. Amos would not be joining them. Lear's justification was encapsulated in a single heavily loaded phrase. He told Amos, "You have become a disruptive element." This was not merely a firing. It was a character assassination disguised as a human resources decision. By labeling Amos a disruptive element, the production team systematically invalidated his entire crusade for racial dignity. They stripped away his legitimate concerns about the racist stereotyping of the JJ character and reduced him to the status of a petulant, unmanageable employee. The phrase was a weapon. It was designed to absolve the white writing staff of any cultural incompetence and place the entire blame for the show's internal friction squarely on the shoulders of the black man who dared to challenge them. Amos did not beg for his job. He did not ask for a compromise. He possessed too much pride forged on the streets of Newark to plead with executives who had just quantified his worth against the sales of a chicken hat. He accepted the verdict, hung up the phone, and walked away from the most successful role of his career. However, firing John Amos was only half of the network's problem. They still had to address the massive, looming presence of James Evans within the narrative of the show. They had to explain to millions of fiercely loyal viewers why the ultimate American patriarch was suddenly gone. The writers were tasked with executing the character, and they did so with a level of cruelty that still resonates in television history. They wrote the 2-part season 4 premiere titled The Big Move. The cruelty of the script lay in its deliberate manipulation of the audience's hope. For 3 years, viewers had watched the Evans family suffer through grinding poverty, gang violence, and systemic humiliation in the Cabrini Green housing projects. The premiere dangled the ultimate salvation in front of them. The storyline revealed that James Evans had finally secured a high-paying job as a partner in a garage in Mississippi. He had traveled ahead to buy a house and prepare a new life. The family was shown joyfully packing their bags, singing and celebrating their imminent escape from the ghetto. The dream was finally being realized. Then the writers delivered the ultimate betrayal, utilizing the most sterile, cowardly method of narrative erasure available, an off-screen death announced by a piece of paper. There was a knock at the apartment door. A telegram was handed to Florida Evans. As the studio audience watched in stunned, breathless silence, Esther Roll opened the yellow envelope and read the message. She was forced to inform her television children and the rest of America that James Evans had been killed in a car crash on a wet road in Mississippi. There was no final heroic act. There was no bedside goodbye where the father could impart his last words of wisdom to his family. There was no funeral shown on screen where his community could gather to mourn his passing. The strongest, most fiercely protective black man on television was simply wiped out of existence between commercial breaks. This specific method of narrative execution was not an accident. It was a highly calculated structural defense mechanism utilized by the network. By killing James Evans off-screen, the producers completely insulated themselves from any further contact with John Amos. They did not have to negotiate a final contract for a farewell episode. They did not have to look him in the eye on a sound stage. More importantly, they denied Amos the opportunity to give his character a dignified, powerful send-off that might have overshadowed the comedic direction they desperately wanted to pursue. The telegram was the ultimate bureaucratic weapon. It allowed the network to murder the moral conscience of their own show without ever getting blood on their hands. It sent a terrifyingly clear message to the rest of the industry. No matter how beloved a black actor becomes, no matter how much cultural weight they carry, they are entirely disposable the moment they threaten the financial agenda of the white men who own the cameras. The psychological impact of this execution on the remaining cast was catastrophic. The filming of the Telegram SC blurred the lines between scripted drama and genuine visceral grief. When Esther Roll dropped the glass bowl in the kitchen and unleashed her iconic agonizing scream of "damn, damn, damn," she was not merely acting out Florida Evans's sudden widowhood. She was actively mourning the destruction of the show's integrity. She was expressing the profound localized grief of losing her closest ally on the set. Amos had been her partner in the grueling trench warfare against the writer's room. Together, they had formed an unbreakable wall of resistance against the degradation of the black family image. With Amos gone, Rolla was left entirely isolated. She was a solitary, dramatic actress trapped in a production that was rapidly accelerating toward full minstrelsy. The immediate aftermath of the execution proved exactly how vital Amos had been to the show's structural integrity. Without the heavy, grounded presence of James Evans, the Cabrini Green apartment felt hollowed out. The natural tension of the show evaporated. The writers immediately filled the vacuum by pushing Jimmy Walker's character into the absolute forefront, transforming the series into a weekly parade of exaggerated catchphrases and slapstick routines. The trauma of losing the father was quickly brushed aside in subsequent episodes to make room for more jokes. The audience, still reeling from the shock of the telegram, watched in dismay as the family they had deeply respected was reduced to a collection of shallow punchlines. For Esther Roll, the situation became intellectually and morally intolerable. She had explicitly demanded a strong father figure as a non-negotiable condition for her participation in the spin-off. She had staked her professional reputation on the promise of presenting a whole, dignified black family. The network had brazenly broken that promise, executed her on-screen husband, and expected her to quietly facilitate the very stereotyping she despised. She refused. The isolation and the plummeting quality of the scripts broke her resolve to stay. By the end of the fourth season, Rolla publicly voiced her intense dissatisfaction with the toxic, clownish direction of the series and walked away from the show entirely. The departure of both parent figures marked the total catastrophic collapse of the original Good Times vision. The network executives had won their immediate battle. They had successfully purged the production of its disruptive elements. They had secured their control over the narrative and maximized the screen time for their most profitable comedic asset. But in executing John Amos and driving away Esther Roll, they completely destroyed the soul of their own creation. The betrayal was absolute. Hollywood had demonstrated with ruthless clarity that it feared a proud, unyielding black man demanding respect far more than it feared a black family living in perpetual comedic poverty. John Amos was handed a death sentence by telegram, but the executives who sent it permanently assassinated the cultural legacy of their own franchise. When the dust settled after the season 4 premiere, the structural integrity of the sitcom did not merely fracture, it disintegrated entirely. The network executives had achieved their primary objective. They had successfully purged the production of its most vocal critic, operating under the arrogant assumption that the series would effortlessly recalibrate around the comedic antics of Jimmy Walker. They were catastrophically wrong. The absence of James Evans created a massive, unfillable vacuum that immediately exposed the creative bankruptcy of the writer's room. Without the looming authoritative presence of the patriarch to ground the narrative in physical and economic reality, the Cabrini Green apartment ceased to be a home. It became a thinly disguised vaudeville stage. The genuine stakes vanished overnight. During the first 3 seasons, a missed paycheck meant actual starvation. It meant the terrifying prospect of the streets swallowing the children. In the aftermath of the telegram, poverty was no longer treated as a systemic horror. It was downgraded to an inconvenient backdrop for slapstick routines. The scripts plunged into sheer, unadulterated absurdity. The audience was increasingly subjected to hollow storylines involving stolen loot, ridiculous neighborhood schemes, and a parade of eccentric, one-dimensional side characters designed specifically to artificially inflate the studio laugh track. The immense burden of maintaining any semblance of dignity fell squarely on the shoulders of Esther Roll, and the weight proved psychologically and artistically unbearable. She was forced to navigate scripts that completely disrespected the memory of the television husband she had fought so fiercely to establish. The writers, realizing too late that the family dynamic was fatally unbalanced, attempted a clumsy correction. They introduced a new love interest for Florida Evans, a character named Carl Dixon. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to paste a new, compliant, patriarchal figure over the gaping wound left by the dismissal of John Amos. The audience rejected the maneuver entirely. The chemistry felt forced. The narrative felt like a betrayal, and the viewers recognized it as a corporate Band-Aid applied to a severed artery. Rowley, feeling increasingly isolated, marginalized, and creatively suffocated by the relentless push toward minstrelsy, abandoned the series at the conclusion of the 4th season. Her departure was the final, devastating blow. The network that had ruthlessly prioritized merchandise sales and cheap laughs over cultural integrity was now left holding a rapidly depreciating asset. Nielsen ratings, the very metric used to justify the execution of James Evans, began a steep, irreversible decline. The viewers had not tuned in simply to hear a catchphrase. They had tuned in to watch a family survive. With the parents effectively erased, there was no family left to root for. The sitcom limped forward, a hollow shell of its former premise. In the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of 1970s Hollywood, the trajectory for an actor who defied a major network was historically predictable. The system was meticulously designed to punish dissent and enforce absolute compliance. When a black actor was labeled difficult or disruptive, it was typically a professional death sentence. The executives at CBS and Norman Lear's production company fully expected Amos to quietly fade into obscurity. They anticipated that the industry would blacklist him, starving him of high-profile opportunities and relegating him to minor theatrical productions, or forcing him into the humiliating position of begging for bit parts on lesser shows. They operated under the arrogant belief that by firing him at the absolute peak of his sitcom fame, they had permanently broken his leverage and ended his career. They assumed they held a complete, unassailable monopoly on his professional future. They completely miscalculated the sheer, undeniable force of the man's talent and his unyielding resilience. John Amos did not retreat into the shadows. He did not issue public apologies to the executives who had fired him. He did not ask for a second chance. Instead, he immediately pivoted, actively seeking out a project that possessed the exact cultural weight, historical gravity, and unvarnished truth that his previous show had so carelessly discarded. He found that salvation in an upcoming television miniseries being aggressively developed by a rival network, ABC. The project was an adaptation of Alex Haley's monumental Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. The title was Roots. The contrast between the two productions was absolute and striking. One was a half-hour sitcom recorded under bright fluorescent lights in front of a live studio audience, increasingly dedicated to amplifying racial caricatures for profit. The other was an expansive, brutally dramatic and painstakingly researched historical epic exploring the multi-generational trauma, profound resilience, and enduring spirit of enslaved Africans in America. It was a project that demanded absolute reverence, strict historical accuracy, and immense psychological depth from its cast. Amos auditioned for and swiftly secured the critical role of the older Kunta Kinte. Amos stepped into the role of the older Kunta Kinte, carrying the fresh wounds of his own Hollywood battles. The character was a proud Mandinka warrior who, even under the threat of unimaginable torture, fiercely refused to surrender his identity or his name. Amos channeled the exact same uncompromising pride that had gotten him fired from a soundstage directly into his performance in the American South. He channeled the exact same stubborn, uncompromising pride that had gotten him fired from a soundstage into his performance in the American South. His portrayal of the adult Kunta Kinte was a definitive masterclass in silent, smoldering defiance. He systematically stripped away any residual sitcom timing or comedic inflection. He communicated volumes of agony and resistance through the rigid posture of his back, the heavy, deliberate cadence of his walk, and the cold, unblinking intensity of his stare. In scenes where Kunta was forced to interact with his enslavers, Amos did not play the subservience. He played the terrifying, barely contained violence of a man strategically biding his time. He perfectly captured the agonizing physical toll of enslavement, yet he never, under any circumstances, allowed the character to look broken. Millions of viewers watched Kunta endure horrific punishments, including the brutal, calculated amputation of his foot, designed to permanently prevent him from escaping. Amos played the aftermath of this mutilation with a devastating quiet strength. He demonstrated with agonizing clarity that while the oppressor possessed the physical power to sever a limb, they lacked the power to sever the man's spirit. It was the ultimate artistic vindication. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was entirely capable of holding the center of a sweeping, heavy dramatic tragedy without relying on a single punchline. When Roots premiered over 8 consecutive nights in January 1977, less than a year after his ruthless dismissal, it did not just air on television, it paralyzed the entire nation. It became an unprecedented cultural earthquake. Over 130 million Americans tuned in to watch the miniseries, shattering every existing television viewing record in history. John Amos stood at the exact beating center of this global phenomenon. The entire country witnessed the sheer, undeniable gravity of his acting. He received a highly deserved Emmy Award nomination for his performance. The network executives who had just dismissed him as a disruptive sitcom actor were forced to sit in their offices and watch him achieve legendary, untouchable status on a rival network. They had fired a television dad via a cowardly telegram, only to watch him resurrect himself as a towering American icon. The monumental success of Roots completely and permanently dismantled the toxic, difficult narrative constructed by his former employers. Amos became professionally bulletproof. He successfully transcended the narrow, suffocating box of network sitcoms that trapped so many of his peers. He transitioned seamlessly and powerfully into feature films and prestigious dramatic television, building a resume of remarkable diversity and strength. In 1988, he co-starred in the massive global blockbuster Coming to America as Cleo McDowell. This role served as another quiet, highly effective triumph of representation. He portrayed a fiercely independent black business owner, a self-made millionaire who built a fast food empire from the ground up, and a fiercely protective patriarch. He proved that he could execute brilliant, razor-sharp comedic timing without ever sacrificing an ounce of dignity. Cleo McDowell was hilarious because of his intense corporate rivalry and his overbearing fatherly protectiveness, not because he was written as an uneducated buffoon. Over a decade later, he stepped onto the meticulously constructed sets of Aaron Sorkin's critically acclaimed political drama, The West Wing. Here, Amos took on the role of Admiral Percy Fitzwallace, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He portrayed a man occupying the absolute highest echelon of global military power. He walked into the Oval Office and commanded the immediate, unquestioned respect of the President of the United States. He delivered dense, highly intellectual dialogue regarding international geopolitics, naval strategy, and the morality of war. He was frequently the smartest, most formidable, and most strategically brilliant man in a room completely filled with powerful white politicians. The distance between the floppy chicken hat he had fiercely rejected and the four-star military uniform of Admiral Fitzwallace was astronomical. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of what John Amos could achieve when he was not being actively suppressed and marginalized by his own writers. Good Times limped toward cancellation in 1979, becoming a creatively bankrupt shell of its former self. By deliberately executing its own moral center, the network effectively destroyed the soul of its franchise. John Amos, however, did not die in that fictional Mississippi car crash. He forced an industry designed to break him to respect him instead. He made a choice few in Hollywood ever make. He chose his conscience over his paycheck. The systematic destruction of James Evans revealed a harsh, enduring truth. The Hollywood establishment was far more terrified of a strong, uncompromising black man, demanding respect than they were of a family living in poverty. John Amos's legacy is not defined by a cowardly telegram. He was the patriarch who refused to play the clown, the executive's pro. They could effortlessly kill a character in the shadows of an off-screen script, but they severely underestimated their opponent. They could never assassinate the truth, and they could never destroy the inherent dignity of the real man.